Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Thanksgiving was perfect, right up until my father looked me dead in the eye and said, "Your brother just got engaged. We're finally getting the wedding we deserve." His words didn't land like a slap. They landed like a knife, slow, cold, and with full intention. The kind that doesn't bleed right away because your brain is still trying to convince you that it didn't really happen. Everyone at the table went silent, but I didn't blink. I just raised my glass, a perfect little crystal flute of dry white wine, smiled and said, "Mine was last month. You just weren't invited. You could have heard the turkey stop breathing. Dad didn't even flinch. That was always his superpower, acting like emotions were other people's problems." Josh choked on his stuffing a little, and Mom reached for her napkin, like maybe this was just some spilled cranberry sauce that she could dab away. My aunt stared at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. But no one said a thing, no congratulations, no what do you mean? Just that thick, syrupy silence that families use instead of dealing with anything real. I didn't expect a parade, but I guess a half-hearted wow would have been something. The truth is, I hadn't planned to say anything. I didn't come home to blow anything up. I told myself I was past all that. The grudges, the old scars, the voice in my head that still sounded like my father telling me I was too emotional every time I cried at 13, or too dramatic when I got into Harvard and he said, "Let's not make a scene." I thought maybe I could just show up, eat some mashed potatoes, make it through the pie course without wanting to scream. But the moment he said finally getting the wedding we deserve, I felt something in me crack. Not like a little hairline fracture. No, this was more like when ice finally breaks on a frozen lake. Loud, sharp, and dangerous. I watched Dad lean back in his chair, arms crossed, like he'd just won a round in a silent war I didn't remember starting. Josh grinned nervously and said, "Well, congrats, Rach?" Like someone trying to find the brakes after already driving off the cliff. "Thanks," I said. "We did it in Maine. Small beach ceremony, just a few friends, no big deal." I let it hang there, no mention of my wife's name, no details. I wasn't about to beg for interest. The silence returned, thick as gravy. What they didn't know, what none of them had cared to ask, was that I hadn't come home for the turkey. I came home to see if the damage could be fixed. And if it couldn't, I needed to know how much more I could live without. The thing about emotional neglect is that it doesn't leave bruises. You grow up wondering if you're imagining it. You try to convince yourself that your dad just had high standards, or your mom was just caught in the middle. You don't realize until much later that love isn't supposed to feel like a performance review. From the minute we sat down at that table, I felt like I was back in high school again. Every glance, every comment from Dad measured, cool, always subtly comparing me to Josh. Josh, who always just needed a little help, who got a pass on everything. Josh, who crashed my car senior year, and I took the fall because Dad said, "Don't ruin his record." Josh, who got arrested for stealing pills at 22 and still got a cake on his birthday. He could do no wrong. Me? I had to earn my seat at the table every year. When I didn't come to Thanksgiving last year, they didn't call. When I didn't send a Christmas card, they didn't ask why. And when I got married last month, quietly, simply, joyfully, I didn't send an invitation because I couldn't imagine explaining why they were even on the list. Still, I had this tiny, idiotic hope that maybe, just maybe, showing up this year would matter. It didn't. My father poured himself another glass of wine, looked right past me, and asked Josh about honeymoon destinations. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I didn't flinch. My mother finally broke the silence. "Well," she said too brightly, "isn't that nice? So much to celebrate." Her eyes didn't meet mine. It was always like that with her. She floated above everything, like an emotional hot air balloon, always rising just high enough to avoid the messy stuff. I used to think she was gentle. Now I think she was just scared. Josh said something about Bali and surf lessons. I excused myself and went to the kitchen, pretending I needed more wine. I gripped the counter until my fingers went white. And then, just like that, something inside me settled. I wasn't sad anymore. I was done. I came back to the table smiling, sat down, and picked up my fork. Everyone was still pretending. The food had gone cold. I looked at my father and said, "Do you want to know her name?" He blinked. "Who?" "My wife," I said. "You know, the person I married without telling you, because I didn't think you'd care." His mouth opened slightly, like he was going to protest. Then he closed it again. "Her name is Nina," I said. "She's brilliant. She treats me like I matter. She makes me laugh so hard I forget to be angry. And when she looks at me, I remember who I am." Still silence, but this time I didn't mind. I had broken the ritual. And once it's broken, you stop bleeding for it. Tomorrow, I would leave, but tonight I would finish my meal in peace. And then, slowly, carefully, I'd start to take back everything they thought they'd taken from me. The next morning, the house smelled like cold stuffing, stale coffee, and old resentment. I sat at the kitchen table with a half-warm cup in my hands, watching the condensation crawl down the window while everyone pretended nothing had happened the night before. Outside, the lawn was still soaked from the rain that had come through earlier in the week, and the sky was that kind of gray that makes you feel like time's standing still. It felt like even the weather knew this family was stuck. No one brought up what I said at dinner. Not my mother, who just moved around the kitchen in her usual fog, humming under her breath like she was trying to summon another reality. Not my father, who left early for his morning walk, as if the universe might reward his cowardice with fresh air and forgetfulness. And definitely not Josh, who stayed in his room longer than usual, probably waiting for me to disappear like I always used to after an emotional incident. But I wasn't going anywhere, not this time. My phone buzzed once. A message from Nina, short and sweet. "You good?" That was the thing about her. She never flooded me with unnecessary questions, never demanded more than I could give. She just held space, always. I stared at the message for a few seconds before replying, "Better than I should be." Last night, I'd laid in bed thinking about how damn quiet it was after I said the words. Not the kind of silence that means people don't know what to say, the kind that means they don't want to say anything, because admitting surprise would be admitting they didn't know me at all. And that was the truth, wasn't it? My own family didn't know the most important parts of my life because they never asked. I could have told them about Nina a year ago. I could have told them how we met at a tech conference in Seattle, where she called me out for interrupting someone during a panel, and I fell in love with her before the coffee break. I could have told them about the weekend we spent in Big Sur, where we hiked the coast, and I told her that I'd never felt more myself than I did around her. I could have told them about the night she proposed in the middle of a thunderstorm with a ring made of sea glass, shaking like a leaf, and the way I cried so hard I couldn't even say yes right away. But why tell people who think love only counts if it comes with a white dress, a priest, and a seating chart with cousins you haven't seen in 10 years? When Josh finally wandered into the kitchen, he was wearing that sheepish smirk he always used when he knew he'd been a coward. He poured himself a mug of coffee, then stood there like a statue, pretending to read the back of the cereal box, even though he's never eaten cereal in the morning a day in his life. I waited. I wasn't going to break the silence this time. I wasn't going to make it easier. "So," he said finally, turning toward me like we were just catching up, "you really got married?" I didn't even look up. I really did. "Wow, that's wild, congrats." His voice had that strained, forced cheerfulness that reminded me of his high school apologies. The ones where he'd say sorry after stealing my bike or breaking my laptop, and then follow it with a joke so he didn't have to sit in the discomfort of being a dick. I took a sip of my coffee and let the silence settle again. "You could have told me," he said, a little quieter. "I mean, we're still siblings." That made me laugh, but not because it was funny. I laughed because it was absurd. "Are we?" I said. "Because for the past 10 years, the only thing you've done consistently is borrow and disappear. You show up when it benefits you, you talk when you need something, and you vanish the second things get uncomfortable. Siblings? Maybe on paper." He looked like I'd hit him with something heavier than words. But he didn't argue. I didn't tell you, I continued, because I knew you'd make it about you, like everything else. And I didn't want that. I didn't want Nina to see what this family does to me. That landed harder than anything else, I think. For a second, he looked like he was going to argue, but then he just nodded and muttered something that sounded like, fair. Josh sat down across from me, his coffee untouched. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. I could see it in his eyes. That restless guilt that bubbles up when people know they've failed you but still can't bring themselves to change. It's easier to stay the golden child when no one asks you to earn it. I'm happy for you, he said after a while, barely above a whisper. Thank you, I replied. We sat there for a minute, the two of us orbiting the ghost of what a sibling relationship could have been. I didn't hate him, but I didn't miss him either. That was the part that surprised me. The realization that whatever connection we had wasn't broken. It just never existed the way I thought it did. Eventually, he stood up, muttered something about needing to make a call, and disappeared down the hallway. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the garage. My old stuff was still in boxes against the far wall, untouched. I found one labeled college, pulled it down, and sat on the concrete floor, blowing off the dust. There were yearbooks, notebooks, a broken Walkman, and near the bottom, a letter. Creased and yellowing, with my own handwriting on the front. Don't send this. I opened it. It was a letter to my father, written when I was 16. In it, I told him how much it hurt to never be enough. I wrote about the way he looked at Josh with pride and looked at me like a checklist. I told him I was tired of earning his love like it was a scholarship. I never sent it. I think some part of me still hoped he'd see me without needing the reminder. But as I sat there reading it as a grown woman, I realized I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't want his approval. I didn't need his blessing. What I wanted was something deeper, something more dangerous. I wanted to reclaim the parts of myself I'd buried to survive this house. That night, I placed the letter in my purse, not to give to him, not yet, but because it reminded me of how far I'd come. It reminded me that my anger wasn't a flaw. It was a map I was finally ready to follow, no matter how uncomfortable the road became. And tomorrow, the road would lead me somewhere very familiar, the lake house. The one thing my father loved more than his own authority, and the one thing he never saw coming. There's something uniquely exhausting about pretending not to be angry when you've spent your entire life being told that your anger is inappropriate. Growing up, I learned early that in our family, silence was a virtue and submission was the unspoken rule. Rage, especially mine, was treated like a malfunction, like some defective setting in my wiring that needed to be repressed or worse, ignored altogether. When I got older and finally started calling things what they were, favoritism, gaslighting, emotional absence, it didn't lead to understanding. It led to more silence. It led to that smug smirk on my father's face, the one he wore like a badge of intellectual superiority, and to Josh's practiced indifference, that shrug he used like a shield whenever things got too real. But that morning, sitting in the living room while Josh told some tired story about his engagement and the really intense bond he felt with his fiancée after 2 months of dating, I looked at him and saw it clearly for the first time. Not jealousy, not resentment, but a kind of withering pity. Josh had been raised with the belief that he deserved everything, and that belief had calcified into entitlement, the kind that doesn't even recognize it's been fed and fattened by someone else's sacrifice. While he droned on, I drifted. My eyes wandered to the framed photos on the bookshelf, school portraits, holiday snapshots, graduation caps tilted at just the right angle. Josh was in nearly every single one. There were maybe 2 with me in them, and even those were off to the side, like an afterthought. In one, from my high school graduation, I stood with a stiff smile while Josh mugged for the camera in my cap. He had dropped out of community college 3 months earlier, but somehow, the day still belonged to him. I didn't remember what story he was telling anymore, something about hiking Machu Picchu and getting altitude sickness. a near-death experience that he somehow turned into a stand-up routine. Everyone laughed politely. Even my mother managed a little chuckle, her hands folded neatly in her lap, like always. I stood up slowly, pretending to stretch, and excused myself to get some air. The moment I stepped outside, I felt it. That old, heavy clarity that only came when I was far enough from their voices to remember my own. I walked down the gravel path that curved behind the house, toward the overgrown garden my mother used to care for, before she gave up on everything that required her presence. I crouched near the old bench where I used to read as a teenager, a place I'd once called my quiet fort, when things inside the house got loud in all the wrong ways. Not yelling, but silence used as a weapon. I pulled out my phone. Nina had sent a photo of our cat curled up on the couch, her little paws tucked under like a loaf of bread. Underneath the picture was a short message. "Still no regrets?" I typed back. "None, but I think I'm ready to play my hand." Because I hadn't come back here just to stand my ground. I'd come to pull something out from under them. 2 weeks earlier, I'd closed on a piece of property. Not just any property, the lake house. The one Dad had been fighting to keep in the family for years, talking about legacy and heritage and all those hollow words that men like him used to justify their dominance. After Grandma died, her estate had split the property between her 2 kids, Dad and Aunt Margie. Margie never wanted it. Dad couldn't afford to buy her out, but I could. And I did, quietly, carefully, with all the precision of someone who'd spent her entire life waiting to be taken seriously. When I returned to the house, I found Josh in the garage, poking through old boxes. He looked up, startled, and gave me a sheepish grin. "Hey, remember this?" he asked, holding up a busted trophy from a childhood soccer league he'd been kicked out of for missing half the season. I nodded. "Yeah, you still have all your participation awards?" He laughed like I was joking, but I wasn't. We stood there for a moment, the dusty air between us thick with everything we'd never said. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see the golden boy. I saw a man who had been praised so often for doing so little that he never learned how to build anything of his own. "You know," I said carefully, "I used to think I hated you." He raised his eyebrows, clearly thrown. "Thanks?" "But I don't," I continued. "I hated what I had to become around you, what I had to swallow to keep the peace. That wasn't your fault, not entirely, but you never made it easier." He frowned, the smile slipping. "I didn't know you felt that way." "You didn't ask," I replied. He looked down at the trophy, his mouth working like he wanted to say more. But he didn't. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked into the kitchen and placed a thick envelope on the counter. Inside were the legal papers. The deed, the transaction records, and a note with one line. "You can still visit, but you don't own it anymore." I didn't plan to be cruel. I planned to be precise. I wanted him and my father to feel what I had felt all my life, displaced, overlooked, silently evicted from their own expectations. As I turned off the lights and stood in the dark kitchen, I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. Someone was still awake. Maybe Josh, maybe my father, maybe someone else who'd finally started to see the cracks. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to be remembered. And this was just the beginning. The next morning broke colder than expected for late November, the air biting against the skin like a warning that winter wasn't far behind. I'd barely slept, lying in bed with my eyes wide open, watching the ceiling blur into darkness, my thoughts spiraling around every conversation I'd ever had with my father that had left me feeling small, invisible, or worse, like I had imagined the whole imbalance. There is a certain fatigue that settles deep into the bones when you finally stop pretending that things are going to get better, not because you've lost hope, but because you finally understood that some people don't want to grow. They just want control. I dressed without making a sound, the hallway still quiet with everyone asleep or pretending to be. As I made my way downstairs, I saw my mother at the stove, moving softly in her robe, stirring something in a pot that smelled like oatmeal and resignation. Her back was turned, but she must have heard me because she said, "You're up early." I paused in the doorway, unsure whether to say something neutral or dive straight into the storm that had been building between us for decades. I chose neither. "I needed air," I said. She nodded without turning around. "It's a beautiful morning, cold but clear." I walked past her and opened the back door, stepping out onto the porch, where the frost still glittered on the wooden railing, untouched by sun or footstep. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I closed my eyes, letting the cold wrap around me, sharp and real. After a few minutes, the door creaked open again, and my mother stepped out, clutching 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one, her fingers brushing mine. It was the first deliberate contact we'd had since I arrived. We stood in silence for a long while, sipping, listening to the quiet hum of birds waking up in the trees, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. "You didn't tell me," she finally said, and her voice was soft, not accusatory, but not forgiving either. "No," I replied, "I didn't." She looked straight ahead, not at me. "Nina wrote me, after the wedding, a handwritten note, said she hoped one day we could meet, said she loved you very much." My stomach dropped, though not out of surprise. Somewhere deep down, I had always suspected Nina would do something like that. Thoughtful, kind, unbearably decent. I had imagined my mother reading it and not knowing how to respond, folding it neatly and sliding it into a drawer to be forgotten. "What did you do with it?" I asked, though I already knew. "I put it away," she said. I didn't know what to say back. I was afraid anything I wrote would sound wrong. I turned to face her now, my voice quiet but clear. "And saying nothing, that felt better?" She winced, just slightly. "I didn't want to make things worse." "They were already worse," I said. "They've been worse for years, and all you ever did was keep quiet. You stood next to him while he dismissed me over and over. You let him rewrite every moment I ever asked for something, needed something, or disagreed with him. You stood by while he turned Josh into the golden boy and made me claw for every ounce of respect. And then when I left, you acted like I just didn't want to be part of the family." Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. My mother never cried when it counted. Only later, in the privacy of rooms no one else entered. "You're right," she whispered. "I should have done more. I should have been better. But I was scared." I didn't say anything. We stood there a little longer until she cleared her throat and went back inside, her mug half full, her robe dragging slightly against the porch. I didn't follow. Instead, I walked to the edge of the yard, where the path to the woods started, the same path that led, eventually, if you stayed on it long enough, to the lake house. By the time I returned, my father was in the kitchen. He sat at the table with the morning paper in front of him, though he wasn't reading. His eyes were fixed on the envelope I had left the night before, its contents now fully revealed, spread out in front of him like a battlefield map. He didn't speak when I entered, didn't accuse, didn't question, just stared. "I bought out Aunt Margie's share," I said, calm and even. "Legally, no tricks. She was happy to sell, said she was tired of waiting for you to stop stalling." He looked up, and for the first time in a very long time, he looked old, not just aged, old, fragile in a way I hadn't imagined possible. "That house was supposed to stay in the family," he said. "It still is," I replied. "I'm family." He didn't respond. "I spent most of my life trying to earn a place at this table," I continued, "trying to impress you, trying to be worth your attention. I realized something this year. I don't need to prove anything anymore. Not to you, not to anyone here. I built a life that you never asked about. I found someone who sees me, really sees me, and I made a choice to stop chasing people who only know how to look past me." He pushed the papers aside, his lips tight. "You think this is revenge?" "No," I said. "I think this is reality. You taught me to fight for scraps, so I stopped asking for scraps and built my own table. Now I own part of yours. You can still visit if you want, but you don't get to pretend you built it alone." He stood up, pushing the chair back so hard it scraped across the floor like a protest. But he didn't speak again. He left the room slowly, like a man walking away from something he thought he owned. Later, I found myself walking the house again, room by room, pausing in the hallway where the old family portraits hung. I stared at one in particular, the four of us at the lake, years ago, the sun setting behind us, and all of us looking at different points on the horizon. Even in the photo, we couldn't look at each other. In that moment, I understood something that settled deep in my chest, like stone. This wasn't just about them not showing up for me. This was about me finally learning that I didn't need them to, not anymore. And tomorrow I would leave again. But this time not empty-handed, not unheard. This time I was leaving with proof. Proof that I could take back what was mine, without permission. The morning I left didn't feel like a triumph, and it didn't feel like defeat either. It felt eerily still, like the air itself knew something irreversible had taken place beneath that roof. The house was quiet, unnaturally so, not the kind of peaceful quiet that families sometimes enjoy on lazy mornings after holidays, but the kind of silence that grows in the aftermath of truths. Too large to be absorbed all at once. It was the silence of people retreating into their respective corners, not because they needed space, but because the truth had knocked something loose in all of them, and no one quite knew what to do with it. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, my packed bag leaning against the wall, watching my father sit at the table with a mug of untouched coffee in front of him. His eyes were glassy, not red with tears, but heavy with the kind of weight that comes when a man realizes that the power he spent a lifetime protecting doesn't mean much in the face of someone who no longer fears him. He didn't speak when I walked in, and I didn't offer pleasantries or parting gestures. I just placed the keys to the lake house on the counter beside the empty cereal bowl someone had forgotten to clean up, and I said, without an ounce of malice, "You don't have to like it, but you'll have to live with it." He didn't turn his head, and I didn't wait for him to. There was nothing left between us that required eye contact. Whatever we had once called a relationship had eroded into formalities a long time ago, and what had replaced it? This quiet war of control, distance, and disappointment had finally reached its natural conclusion. He could sit with the consequences of decades of choosing silence over connection, pride over humility, and one child over another. I no longer needed to explain it. As I turned to leave the kitchen, I passed by my mother, who stood by the window holding a dish towel like it was a lifeline. Her face was drawn, not with anger or defiance, but with a quiet kind of shame that never quite reached the surface of her expression. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, and I knew that whatever apology she might have been trying to form would stay stuck inside her, buried beneath layers of learned helplessness and unspoken regret. I didn't stop walking. Josh was waiting for me at the front door, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. I paused when I saw him, not out of hesitation, but because I could feel that he was about to say something he hadn't practiced. That alone was rare enough to make me give him a moment. "Mom told me about the letter," he said quietly, his voice low and unfamiliar in its seriousness. "The one from Nina." I nodded but didn't respond. "I didn't know," he continued, still avoiding eye contact, as if what he had to say would turn to dust if he looked at me directly. "I didn't know how far gone things were between you and them. I thought you were just keeping your distance, not that you'd given up entirely." I tilted my head slightly. "There's a difference?" He finally met my gaze. "Yeah, I think there is. And I think I crossed it a long time ago, too. I just didn't realize it because they always made it feel like distance was normal." There was a beat of silence before he added, "I talked to Emily this morning, my fiancée. I told her everything. I told her about the DUI, about stealing your ideas in college, about how much you covered for me. I told her the truth." I studied his face for a moment, searching for the guilt, the shame, the fear, anything that might suggest he was saying this for a reason deeper than self-preservation. "And?" I asked, my voice flat. "She's not thrilled," he admitted, "but she said if I want a future with her, I need to start living in truth, not in legacy." That caught me off guard. I had underestimated her. I had assumed she was another mirror to the family image. Polite, polished, blind to the cracks, but maybe she saw more than I gave her credit for. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't owe him that. But I did offer a small nod, not as a sign of approval, but as acknowledgement that even the golden boy might be waking up from the illusion. "I hope you don't screw it up," I said, and I meant it. He opened the door for me, and I stepped out into the cold November air, the wind brushing against my face like a final cleansing. I walked to the car and slid into the driver's seat, but before I started the engine, I pulled the old letter from my purse, the one I had written at 16 and carried with me all this time. The ink had faded in spots, and the paper had softened, but the pain in those words was still sharp and clear. I read it aloud to myself, every single line. And when I reached the end, the part where I begged him to see me, to hear me, to love me the way he loved Josh, without having to prove myself 100 times over, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not closure, not peace, but space. The kind of space you make when you finally stop letting someone else define your worth. I got out of the car, walked to the edge of the driveway, and lit the letter with a match from the emergency kit in the glove box. I watched it burn, the paper curling inward as the flames devoured it, the smoke rising into the air like a signal, not to them, not to the people inside that house, but to me. A signal that I had let go of something that had once held me hostage. As the last edge of the letter crumbled into ash, I whispered, not to anyone in particular, "Maybe next Thanksgiving I'll send an invitation, or maybe not." The wind carried the ashes away, scattering them across the brittle grass and the edge of the cold road, and I didn't look back. Not because I was done, because I was just beginning. I slid behind the wheel, turned the ignition, and drove.